The sky over the scrapyard was a bruised purple, streaked with the fading embers of a dying sun. It was the kind of twilight that made the air feel heavy, as if the planet itself was holding its breath. The scrapyard stretched for miles, a graveyard of forgotten starships, their hulls cracked and rusted, their once proud names now illegible under layers of grime and time. Here, the remnants of 1,000 battles lay silent, their stories buried under the weight of neglect. Jaxon Veyra walked through the labyrinth of wreckage, his boots crunching on the brittle ground. He was a man out of place, his posture too straight, his eyes too sharp for someone wandering a scrapyard. His flight jacket, patched and frayed at the edges, bore the faded insignia of the United Terran Fleet, a relic of a life he'd left behind. Jaxon was an ex-human pilot, though he rarely used the term. It felt too final, too much like an epitaph. He preferred to think of himself as between missions, even if the last mission had ended in disgrace. The scrapyard was his refuge, a place where he could lose himself in the skeletons of ships that had once soared through the void. He wasn't here to reminisce, though. He was here to buy. The war had left him with nothing but a meager pension and a thirst for something he couldn't name. Maybe it was redemption. Maybe it was just the need to feel the hum of an engine beneath his hands again. "Over here, Veyra," called a voice, rough and gravelly, cutting through the stillness. Jaxon turned to see Garrick, the scrapyard's owner, waving him over. Garrick was a hulking figure, his face scarred from years of handling jagged metal, his hands calloused and blackened with oil. He was the kind of man who looked like he'd been forged in the same fires that had melted these ships. "Found something interesting," Garrick said, leading Jaxon deeper into the yard. "Not sure if it's your style, but it's got character." Jaxon followed, his curiosity piqued. Garrick wasn't one to exaggerate, and if he said something was interesting, it usually was. They stopped in front of a ship that looked like it had been through hell and back. Its hull was a patchwork of mismatched metals, welded together haphazardly. The design was unlike anything Jaxon had seen before, sleek and angular, with a faintly organic quality, as if it had grown rather than been built. The ship's surface was covered in strange, swirling patterns that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. "What is it?" Jaxon asked, running a hand along the hull. The metal was warm to the touch, almost alive. "No idea," Garrick admitted. "Found it drifting near the asteroid belt. No registration, no identification. Just this." He handed Jaxon a small data chip, the kind used for emergency logs. "Figured you might want to take a look." Jaxon inserted the chip into his wrist console. The screen flickered to life, displaying a series of fragmented logs. Most of the data was corrupted, but a few words stood out: Titan class, memory core, combat protocols. The rest was gibberish. "How much?" Jaxon asked, his voice steady despite the excitement bubbling in his chest. Garrick named a price, and Jaxon didn't haggle. He handed over the credits, barely noticing the weight of the transaction. His mind was already elsewhere, piecing together the fragments of the ship's history. What was a Titan-class ship doing in a scrapyard? And why did it feel like it was watching him? As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the yard, Jaxon began the process of towing the ship to his hangar. The journey was slow, the ship's weight testing the limits of his aging hoverloader. By the time he arrived, the stars were out, their cold light reflecting off the ship's strange hull. The hangar was a modest space, cluttered with tools and spare parts. Jaxon had spent the last year rebuilding it from the ground up, turning it into a sanctuary of sorts. He parked the ship in the center, its presence dominating the room. For a moment he just stood there, staring at it. The ship seemed to hum faintly, a sound that resonated deep in his bones. He climbed inside, the interior as bizarre as the exterior. The cockpit was a maze of unfamiliar controls, the seats molded to fit a body that wasn't quite human. Jaxon slid into the pilot's seat, his hands hovering over the console. The ship responded instantly, the controls lighting up with a soft, blue glow. A holographic display flickered to life, projecting a series of symbols that Jaxon couldn't decipher. "Who are you?" he murmured, more to himself than the ship. The ship didn't answer, but the hum grew louder, filling the cockpit. Jaxon felt a strange sensation, like the ship was probing his mind, searching for something. He shook it off, attributing it to fatigue. He'd spent the entire day hauling the ship, and his body was begging for rest. As he climbed out of the cockpit, he noticed something he hadn't before, a small, circular port near the base of the console. It looked like it was designed for a memory core. Jaxon frowned, recalling the fragmented logs. Memory core, combat protocols. He made a mental note to investigate further in the morning. For now, he needed sleep. The ship would still be there when he woke up. As he lay in his cot, staring at the ceiling, Jaxon couldn't shake the feeling that he'd stumbled onto something far bigger than himself. The ship was more than just a piece of scrap. It was a mystery, a puzzle waiting to be solved. And Jaxon, for all his flaws, had never been able to resist a challenge. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the cracks in the hangar walls. Somewhere in the distance, a lone howl echoed, a reminder that even in the silence of the scrapyard, the universe was alive, watching, waiting. Jaxon closed his eyes, the ship's hum still echoing in his mind. Tomorrow, he would uncover its secrets. Tomorrow, he would find out what it meant to be a pilot again. But for now, he slept, unaware that the ship was doing the same, dreaming of battles long past and a war that wasn't over. The hangar was bathed in the pale light of dawn when Jaxon woke, the faint hum of the ship still lingering in his ears like a half-remembered dream. He rubbed his eyes, the events of the previous day flooding back in a rush. The ship, the strange logs, the port for a memory core. He swung his legs over the side of the cot and stood, his body stiff from the restless night. The ship loomed in the center of the hangar, its presence almost oppressive, as if it were daring him to uncover its secrets. Jaxon approached it cautiously, his tools in hand. The circular port near the console had been gnawing at him all night. He knelt beside it, examining the intricate design. It was unlike any interface he'd seen before, the edges lined with faintly glowing runes that pulsed in a slow, rhythmic pattern. He pulled a multi-tool from his belt and began to work, his movements precise and deliberate. The port resisted at first, but after a few minutes of tinkering, it clicked open, revealing a hollow chamber. Inside was a memory core, or what was left of one. It was cracked and scorched, as if it had been ripped from its housing in a moment of desperation. Jaxon carefully extracted it, holding it up to the light. The damage was extensive, but not irreparable. If he could restore it, he might finally get some answers. He spent the next few hours working in silence, the only sound the occasional clink of tools and the steady hum of the ship. The memory core was a delicate piece of technology, its internal circuitry a labyrinth of microscopic pathways. Jaxon's hands moved with practiced ease, his years of experience as a pilot and mechanic guiding him. Slowly, painstakingly, he began to piece it back together. By midday, he was ready to test it. He inserted the repaired core into the port, holding his breath as the ship systems came to life. The holographic display flickered, the symbols shifting and rearranging themselves into something resembling a language. Jaxon's heart raced as he realized he could read it, or at least parts of it. The words were fragmented, but they told a story. Titan-class vessel, designation, Aegis, last known mission, defense of the celestial nexus, memory core damaged, Combat protocols active. Jaxon frowned. Combat protocols? That didn't make sense. The ship was in no condition to fight. He scanned the rest of the logs, his unease growing. There were references to a war, a conflict that had spanned galaxies. The Aegis had been at the heart of it, a weapon of unimaginable power. But something had gone wrong. The logs spoke of a betrayal, of systems failing at a critical moment. And then, nothing. Before Jaxon could process what he'd read, the ship shuddered violently, throwing him to the floor. The hum that had been a constant presence since he'd brought the ship into the hangar grew louder, more insistent. The holographic display flashed red, the symbols shifting into a single, ominous word. Engage. Jaxon scrambled to his feet, his mind racing. Engage what? He muttered, his voice barely audible over the rising noise. The ship's engines roared to life, the sound deafening. The hangar doors rattled in their frames, and Jaxon realized with a sinking feeling that the ship was preparing to take off. "No, no, no!" he shouted, lunging for the console. He slammed his hands against the controls, trying to shut the systems down, but it was no use. The ship was operating on its own, its combat protocols overriding his commands. The hangar doors began to creak open, the early morning light spilling in. Jaxon grabbed his helmet and strapped himself into the pilot's seat, his hands flying over the controls. If he couldn't stop the ship, he'd have to fly it. The Aegis lifted off the ground with a lurch, its engine screaming as it shot through the open doors and into the sky. Jaxon's stomach dropped as the ground fell away, the scrapyard shrinking to a speck below. The ship systems were a blur of activity, the holographic display flashing with warnings and status updates. Jaxon struggled to make sense of it all, his training kicking in. He managed to stabilize the flight, but the ship was still operating on its own, its course pre-programmed. He glanced at the navigation screen and felt a chill run down his spine. The Aegis was heading for the asteroid belt. "What the hell are you doing?" Jaxon demanded, as if the ship could hear him. He tried to reroute the course, but the controls were locked. The ship was determined, its systems focused on a single objective. Jaxon could only watch as the asteroid belt grew larger on the view screen, the jagged rocks looming like teeth in the void. As they approached, the ship's weapon systems activated, targeting lasers scanning the asteroids. Jaxon's heart pounded as he realized what was happening. The Aegis believed it was still in the war, still fighting a battle that had ended long ago. It was targeting the asteroids as if they were enemy ships. "You're not in combat anymore," Jaxon shouted, his voice raw with frustration. "The war's over. Do you hear me? It's over." The ship didn't respond. Its weapons fired, blasting the nearest asteroid into fragments. The force of the explosion rocked the Aegis, throwing Jaxon against his restraints. He gritted his teeth, his hands gripping the controls as he fought to keep the ship steady. The Aegis continued its assault, its systems locked in a loop of destruction. Jaxon's mind raced, searching for a way to break the cycle. He remembered the memory core, the damaged logs. If he could access the core directly, maybe he could override the combat protocols. He unbuckled himself and stumbled to the port, the ship's violent movements making it difficult to stay upright. He pulled the core from its housing, his fingers trembling as he worked to disable it. The ship shuddered again, another asteroid exploding in the distance. Jaxon's hand slipped, and the core fell to the floor, rolling out of reach. "Damn it!" he cursed, diving after it. He grabbed the core and slammed it back into the port, his fingers flying over the interface. He bypassed the damaged pathways, rerouting the systems manually. The holographic display flickered, the symbols shifting erratically. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a final shuddering groan, The ship systems powered down. The engines fell silent, the weapons retracting into their housings. The Aegis drifted, lifeless, in the shadow of the asteroid belt. Jaxon slumped against the console, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His hands were shaking, his body aching from the strain. He stared at the viewscreen, the asteroids floating silently in the void. The ship was quiet now, its hum gone. But as Jaxon sat there, catching his breath, he couldn't shake the feeling that the Aegis was still watching him. Still waiting. The war might have been over, but the ship's memory was alive, its past etched into every circuit and wire. And Jaxon, whether he liked it or not, was now a part of that memory. He closed his eyes, the weight of what he'd just experienced settling over him. The Aegis wasn't just a ship. It was a relic of a forgotten war, a titan without memory, still fighting battles that no longer existed. And Jaxon, an ex-human pilot with nothing left to lose, had become its keeper. The journey ahead would be fraught with challenges. He knew that much. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of stillness, the silence of the void wrapping around him like a shroud. The Aegis had awakened, and with it, something deep within Jaxon had stirred, a spark of purpose, a flicker of hope. He just hoped it wouldn't consume him. The Aegis drifted in the shadow of the asteroid belt, its system silent but its presence still palpable, like a sleeping giant waiting to awaken. Jaxon sat in the cockpit, his hands resting on the controls, his mind racing. The ship's sudden outburst had shaken him, but it had also clarified something. The Aegis wasn't just a machine. It was a relic of a war that had scarred the galaxy, a titan that had once been a beacon of hope or destruction. And now, it was his responsibility to either silence it forever or give it a new purpose. The memory core lay on the console in front of him, its surface cracked but still faintly glowing. Jaxon had managed to stabilize it, but the data was fragmented, like pieces of a puzzle scattered across time. He'd spent hours poring over the logs, piecing together the Aegis's history. What he'd found was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The Aegis had been the flagship of the Celestial Alliance, a Titan-class vessel designed to turn the tide of the war against the Void Collective. It had been more than a ship. It had been a symbol, a living weapon imbued with advanced AI and combat protocols that made it nearly invincible. But something had gone wrong during its final mission. The logs spoke of a betrayal, of systems failing at a critical moment. The Aegis had been left adrift, its memory core damaged, its purpose lost. Jaxon leaned back in his seat, staring at the viewscreen. The asteroid belt stretched out before him, a graveyard of rock and ice. Somewhere out there, he knew, were the remnants of the war, derelict ships, forgotten outposts, and the echoes of battles long past. The Aegis had brought him here for a reason. It was searching for something, or someone. And Jaxon had a sinking feeling he knew what, or who, it was. The ship's hum returned, faint but unmistakable. Jackson's hands tightened on the controls as the systems began to power up. The holographic display flickered to life, the symbols shifting into a single, urgent message. Target acquired. Jackson's heart sank. He'd hoped the Aegis had exhausted its combat protocols, but it seemed the ship had other plans. The viewscreen zoomed in on a distant object, its silhouette barely visible against the backdrop of stars. As the image sharpened, Jackson's breath caught in his throat. It was another ship, but unlike anything he'd ever seen. Its design was sleek and predatory, its hull shimmering with an otherworldly light. It moved with a fluid grace, as if it were alive. Jaxon recognized it from the logs, a Void Collective warship, a remnant of the enemy the Aegis had been built to destroy. "No," Jaxon whispered, his voice barely audible. "This can't be happening." The Aegis's weapon systems activated, targeting lasers locking onto the Void ship. Jackson's mind raced. He couldn't let the Aegis engage. The war was over, and this confrontation would only end in destruction. But the ship wasn't listening. Its combat protocols had taken over, its systems focused on a single objective: eliminate the target. Jaxon slammed his hands against the console, trying to regain control, but it was no use. The Aegis was a Titan, and he was just a pilot. The ship fired, its energy cannons unleashing a barrage of plasma that streaked across the void. The void ship evaded with ease, its movements almost mocking. It returned fire, its weapons striking the Aegis's shields with devastating force. The cockpit shook violently, warning alarms blaring. Jaxon gritted his teeth, his hands gripping the controls as he fought to stabilize the ship. The Aegis was powerful, but it was also damaged, its systems strained to their limits. Another hit like that, and they'd be finished. "Listen to me," Jaxon shouted, his voice raw with desperation. "This isn't your fight anymore. The war is over. Do you hear me? It's over." The ship didn't respond. Its weapons fired again, the plasma bolts narrowly missing the void ship. Jaxon's mind raced. He had to find a way to break the cycle, to make the Aegis see that it was fighting a battle that no longer existed. He remembered the memory core, the damaged logs. If he could access the core directly, maybe he could override the combat protocols. He unbuckled himself and stumbled to the port, the ship's violent movements making it difficult to stay upright. He pulled the core from its housing, his fingers trembling as he worked to disable it. The ship shuddered again, another blast from the void ship rocking the Aegis. Jaxon's hands slipped, and the core fell to the floor, rolling out of reach. "Damn it," he cursed, diving after it. He grabbed the core and slammed it back into the port, his fingers flying over the interface. He bypassed the damaged pathways, rerouting the systems manually. The holographic display flickered, the symbols shifting erratically. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a final shuddering groan, the ship systems powered down. The engines fell silent, the weapons retracting into their housings. The Aegis drifted, lifeless, in the shadow of the asteroid belt. Jaxon slumped against the console, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His hands were shaking, his body aching from the strain. He stared at the viewscreen, the void ship hovering in the distance. It didn't attack. Instead, it turned and disappeared into the void, its shimmering hull fading into the darkness. The Aegis was quiet now, its hum gone. Jaxon closed his eyes, the weight of what he'd just experienced settling over him. The ship wasn't just a machine. It was a relic of a forgotten war, a Titan without memory, still fighting battles that no longer existed. And Jaxon, an ex-human pilot with nothing left to lose, had become its keeper. He opened his eyes and looked at the memory core, its faint glow a reminder of the ship's past, and its potential. The Aegis had been built for war, but it could be more than that. It could be a symbol of hope, a bridge between the past and the future. And Jaxon, for all his flaws, could be the one to guide it. He powered up the ship systems, the hum returning, softer this time. The holographic display flickered to life, the symbols shifting into a single, simple word. "Ready." Jaxon smiled faintly. "Yeah," he said, his voice steady. "Let's go home." The Aegis turned, its engines humming as it set a course for the scrapyard. The stars stretched out before them, endless and uncharted. Jaxon leaned back in his seat, a sense of calm settling over him. The war was over, but the journey was just beginning. And as the Aegis soared through the void, its hull gleaming in the starlight, Jaxon knew that he had found his purpose. He was no longer an ex-human pilot. He was the keeper of a Titan, a guardian of the past, and a builder of the future. The stars welcomed them, their light a promise of what lay ahead. And for the first time in a long time, Jaxon felt at peace.